What up, everybody? I'm Hilo from New Leaf Studios, and this is Watch Me Whip, Part 1, The Sketch. So, with a lot of these drawings, like the Draw This in Your Own Style drawings, I'm working off somebody else's character, so there's usually not a lot of hyper thinking involved. Like, I don't get into this stage where I'm just really thinking about every single aspect. I'm really just using someone else's detail and building from it. But with this one, the sketch was probably the most difficult part because I was trying to take the concept that they had and put it into the context of like how does this guy actually move around in the world and things like that, and like how would we see him in the world. And he has a very contradictory kind of character to him. Like he's a giant, but he's also like a stealthy kind of assassin, or Goliath giant, whatever you want to call it. But he's huge. He's supposed to be like 13 feet tall and still is like an assassin, a very stealthy assassin. So it's kind of a contradictory thing. So it was a little hard to kind of think about how could I portray this guy in a very accurate way. And then in the sketch, as you can see, I've been drawing these legs over and over. So that was like a really difficult part. Was his stance was just I don't do this stance very often, and I think it's just kind of a difficult one to do when you have front foot forward, 1 foot back, and then how to make that look believable, and then the weight, the tension that is going to be on the legs, and how do you just make the posture look very believable. So this was just a really difficult, for me specifically, it was a really difficult pose to draw in. I kept elongating the legs, which was a problem. The top part was actually pretty fairly easy, and if you could tell, I used the symmetry tool just to save a little time at the beginning when it came to making his body. I typically don't use the symmetry tool just because it's somewhat unnatural. Like there is no natural symmetry. Like everything is, it might look symmetrical, but it's somewhat asymmetrical, no matter what. So, like the natural world doesn't really do symmetry. So symmetry is always just kind of like, it's a human thing. It's something that humans like to see because it's different from the asymmetrical world. And because obviously people like when things are, collaborative, like both sides feel clean and feel the same and all that kind of stuff. So it's just kind of a psychological trick, to be honest. When you use symmetry in your art, it has a natural aesthetic because it's actually kind of different from the natural world, which is typically it's usually the opposite. It's like you want to use the natural world as a basis for your aesthetic. As you'll see, I still wasn't really happy with the legs. At some point, I'm going to change that in this drawing. Actually, I guess I forgot to record that part. All right. Well, I did change the legs at some point. So yeah, I just decided that the stance, the drawing that I was making, it didn't look right to me. It didn't feel right. I think the legs were just very elongated. I guess I didn't record the modification of it, but you'll see in this line work that the legs are very different. I just opened him up, so he has a wide stance, and then I just jumped into the line work, which the line work was here was fairly easy. I know I did change a few things when it comes to the line work, so there was some thought process involved, like, hey, I want to change this or make this different or whatever the case may be. Typically when I have a really defined sketch, or I've spent a lot of time sketching, I don't tend to change too much in terms of the line work, but everything is different, sometimes, or every drawing is different. Sometimes I get to the seventh sketch, and then I'm like, I want to go back to the first iteration with certain aspects of it. So every sketch is different, every drawing is different, every illustration is different. You have the same process, but that doesn't mean you're going to do the exact same thing every single time. So yeah, I did make a few changes, I think, and just a couple small areas, but the legs are probably the biggest one. And yeah, the line work for this drawing was actually really satisfying. It felt like the drawing was really coming together after all that time I had spent trying to figure it out and sketch it. So it just felt like, yes, this is becoming complete. I can feel this character kind of coming to life a little more. And I think that's always important when you're an illustrator, to have the mindset of like the life of the character. It's not just a drawing; it has to kind of live in a certain degree. It has to have some basis of like it's kind of like when you're a kid and you're playing with toys, you have this imaginary aspects to these characters, and you play with it. Like sometimes I'll draw and I'll be making like sound effects like whoosh, whoosh, yeah, and he'll slice them like this, or you know what I mean. Like, so I'm always just kind of thinking of how is this person moving, what's the life, what kind of life do they have, or just some background information, because it helps you define the drawing in just a little bit, or the illustration, the final illustration, in just a little bit more detail and depth, and that's only going to help you, especially when it comes to like your viewership, to kind of make them feel like this thing is real. So entering into the color aspect, I know I kind of zoomed through this one. I blocked out the color before that, because I in the past videos I feel like I don't really need to show you guys the block color. I've shown you, numerous times that I block out my colors before I actually start doing them. So I kind of just annexed that part from the video, and I don't think I'll be putting that in the future videos. It'll just always start with the block color, and then I'll just build on it from there. In terms of the color scheme here, was actually very interesting. I did diverge from the original character color scheme just a little bit. I added some just tonal changes, but I kept pretty much the same color scheme. The skin, I do change after this, but this was like, I wanted like a warm feeling to help build that red color right there, and have it not be the only splash of red there, like, so there's a little bit of warmth in there in the skin color. I eventually did change it to actually a cooler, like a gray color, desaturated gray color, which is the skin tone that he had, is more of like a white skin tone for the original drawing. And I just dug these lines, these like blue striped like pirate pants looking things. That was actually probably like I was most excited to fill those out and play with the colors a little bit. It is a little bit different from the original character art color scheme. In the original character art, it was like a cool gray, so I just kind of pulled that out a little further and saturated it a little more, just so we get some more saturation in there. You always want to have, you could do monochrome coloring, which is, it's just one color, and you could, focus on grays and then give it like a splash of red, or splash of color in some way. So you could do that, and that's totally fine. I wanted just a little bit more color in this, because I knew when I'm doing the lighting effects, it's going to change some of the colors, how they look anyway. So I desaturated a little bit the pants before I went. So yeah, I started off with more saturation, then I started desaturating as I went on, because again, the lighting is going to change how the colors look anyway. This is where I changed the warm to more of a cool. And then applying the finishing touches. This one actually took a bit longer. I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do for the background, and I was like, I think I want to make it like he's in this fantasy village, like this old kind of village with cobblestone everywhere, like big monolithic kind of buildings. And even I wanted to have the feeling that even this archway was a very big archway, like not archway, but or like a corridor. So even like a normal sized person, like that ceiling would be really, really high. Comparative to the person, and as you can tell, like if he's a giant, he's going to take up more of that space, so he's filling up a majority of that space, which is supposed to be a very large corridor. I was playing with a few brushes, just trying to get the feel of like how I wanted to execute the background. Again, because I was just kind of exploring, I didn't really know what I wanted to do going into it, so I just started playing with some brushes. I found a brush that I liked, and then I was like, okay, let me execute just these cobblestones, and then see where I can go from there. And yeah, it just all kind of came together after I figured out this is the brush I want to use, and the methodology of mixing, like using the mixer brush and things like that. Sometimes that's all it takes, is just that one little breakthrough of, oh, this is the right brush. I was just using the wrong brush to try and get what I wanted out of the scene, and then you change your brush a little bit, and it just kind of, it all comes together at that point. So it does happen a lot. you know, when it comes to figuring out a background or just in general, sometimes the tools do affect the outcome. If you're not using the right tools that just don't fit with what you want from the outcome of the drawing, then it can completely derail you. So just sometimes, you know, just changing little things like that can really have a breakthrough in what you're doing. So I did figure out the background eventually, and now I'm just playing with how I want the contrast to be from the foreground to the background, and then how that's going to affect the character art. Like I said, I don't really do the shading until I have a background, because it kind of helps educate how I'm going to have my lighting effects and my shadows, things like that. So I wanted to really nail that home before I moved into the shadow aspect of it and the lighting. I kind of decided, well, at the beginning, I always saw this being like with a purple kind of like purple lighting for some reason. And right here, I'm just making some modifications because I wanted it to feel like I guess just a bit more realistic, in the sense that it's the perspective moving backward in space is just a little more apparent, and it just didn't feel right with his positioning. I wanted to make sure that the lighting was correct from both sides, figuring that out and stuff like that, and then just making sure the scaling was correct. So I opened it up a little bit more, so now, yeah, again, it feels like there's this open corridor that he's just standing in, and it's kind of like this is the last thing that you see. You're about to kind of like walk through this corridor, and he just emerged from the shadows, and you know, he's ready to go, and that's probably the last time. That's the last time you're ever going to see anything. See this huge giant, you know, in a corridor with these ginormous blades, and you're pretty much done for. So the shadowing here was a little tricky in the sense that it's probably not 100% correct from the lighting aspect and things like that. I did try to make it, you know, as correct as I possibly could, but there's probably still some improvements I could make. You know, I did talk about in the last video, I'm not aiming for perfection in these drawings. I'm just aiming for a final. I'm aiming for something I can follow through with that does feel good. It does feel somewhat correct. Obviously, I'm not gonna, you know, just make a drawing that looks completely incorrect, but also I'm not aiming for perfection. I'm aiming for a manageable illustration that I can finish one time through, so I can start from a sketch and end with my final lines, shading, and all that at one time. I'm not going to keep coming back to these drawings and redoing them, or, you know, being a perfectionist about where the light's coming from and things like that. To me, the importance of these drawings is just the completion of them, or these illustrations is just the completion of them. So it's really important to know your goal before you start out on any project, I think. And then as the project goes on, you can change your approach, but I think that it really comes down to just keeping that, keeping what's important to you in your mind, not playing with the importance that everyone else is going to find in it, but it's just about you. Like, what do you find important with this drawing? What do you, or this illustration, what do you want to capture? What do you want to focus on? And all those things. And it doesn't have to be perfect in anyone else's eyes. It doesn't even have to be perfect in your eyes. It just has to be complete. It has to feel like you accomplished something, you pushed yourself a little bit, you did something that maybe was a little out of your comfort zone. It might not be like the best way that you could do it. You could do it better maybe in, you know, 6 months to a year, but you did it, you completed it, and that was important to me. So again, the lighting is not completely perfect. I don't think anything in this drawing is completely perfect, but again, that wasn't my goal. So just knowing your goal, knowing what you want to do with your illustrations, again, is just a very important part of the process as well. You know, kind of pre-planning out what you want to accomplish with your pieces. So I'm just putting the final touches on the lighting effects, and I decided to go with a green and a purple, and then that's the final piece right here. And thank you so much for watching. Watch me whip. Definitely follow Contraband Artist on Instagram. He's a great artist.